Hello, I'm Jonathan Friedman, Admissions Director and Associate Professor at the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. An important aspect of IISHJ is providing adult learning opportunities and resources along with the professional programs and publications that we provide. So, along those lines, I'm delighted to talk with Gil Kidron, a writer, editor, and podcaster now living in Barcelona, who will be sharing about a podcast of biblical proportions. That's the name of his podcast, a podcast of biblical proportions. Gil, good to see you.
Hi, Jonathan. Good to see you. It's a little bit ironic, right? The name, a podcast of biblical proportions.
Is that
Eh,
aspirational? Are you hoping that it grows in size as the years go on?
Of course, that's what everyone hopes, and it's been doing well. I'm not complaining. So, as you said, I'm like before I was a podcaster, I was mostly a Hebrew-speaking writer and editor. And my entire life, I've been writing and editing either my own stories, a novel, blogs, and such, and editing other people's stories. I was also a translator and a film critic, TV critic, and basically the through line is that I just love stories, and I spend my life writing stories, thinking about other people's stories, commenting on them. And this is basically the perspective that I brought to the stories of the Bible. Just thinking about stories, what is the story about? What is the perspective? What is it trying to tell us? Who could be the person who wrote it? What kind of person he would be? And stuff like that. 3 years ago, started the podcast.
So, why the Bible exactly? Why did you take this deep dive?
Aha. It was always this thing that I wanted to do, but because in Israel, if you are a secular atheistic Jew, basically the Bible is inaccessible to you culturally, and also you're kind of discouraged even to read up on it, and it's not attractive to Israeli Jews. So I took my time, I guess, but then when I was looking for a new project, I was like, okay, if you do it, you have to do it seriously. Have to go story by story by story by story and apply the same thinking that I apply to, sci-fi movies and whatever, Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or whatever it is, to the stories of the Bible, because for me, a text is a text is a text, and you can build a profile of the person who wrote a story, no matter if the story was written 50 years ago or 2,500 years ago.
Yeah, sort of along those lines, it's been said that you can take the Bible literally or you can take the Bible seriously. So, how does your approach maybe differ from the serious approach of biblical scholars, trained historians, archaeologists, and literary, scholars who might look at the text as a historical document and not a devotional document?
Yeah. So, disclaimer, I got this question ahead of time. So I had time to think about it because it was a very interesting question and it made me think. And I realized that basically I can say I read the Bible both seriously and literally, depending what that means. So I think that religious people, what among the things that they bring to the text, to the reading, to the way that they see the text, is passion and love for the text. And I think that's very important. And it's very conducive if you want to understand a story, if you come into it with passion. And academics on the other side, obviously, they bring whatever, the rigorous work and realistic thinking about it. And you can combine both reading the Bible passionately and dispassionately in order to get a complete picture. Because reading it literally, basically, I do read it literally. I pay attention to every single word that is written because a writer writes words and expressions and literary motifs for a reason. He's trying to tell us something very, very specific, not something vague or opaque, trying to make a point. And that's so in that way, I read it literally. Seriously, I read it in the fact that I know a person wrote it. So there's a human motivation behind it. Why is it like it can't be a motivation that I cannot fathom or understand, right? It has to be something that, okay, I know these kinds of stories, I know these kind of writers, this makes sense. And I enjoy, looking for answers that come up when you read the Bible this way.
Yeah, it sounds to me like maybe you read it literarily as opposed to literally, in the sense that you're looking for an authorial voice that maybe links these sometimes strange and convoluted stories because of the editing and the sort of editorial interventions. You're trying to piece together maybe a logical storytelling in a document that often contradicts itself and so forth and so on.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, fiction, historical accounts, prophecies, poems, laws, rules, they are all historical documents of one kind or another. Like music, I know that you researched music. When you learn about music made in 3000 BC, it's a historical document about that time and place's culture, right? So the same for the Bible. You have the elements there from the time it was made and the person who made it.
Yeah, I actually refer to that as cultural accuracy. So even if the story is not historically
Right.
true or based on real events, there's something culturally true about it.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Exactly.
So, how might your approach and your method of reading and teaching about the Bible appeal to secular humanistic Jews, specifically some of whom maybe have an allergic reaction to the traditional readings of the Torah and, Torah
Mhm.
study, biblical commentaries by the rabbis and so forth?
So I think there are many differences between how I approach it and also how academics approach it. And maybe a main difference, I don't know if it's the main difference, but a major difference is that because I come at it as a writer and editor, I don't think that stories are about their plot. Okay, so like the plot of the story, that's not what the story is actually about. And for example, I was taking for an example for our conversation, I was thinking, okay, Spider-Man. Okay, Spider-Man. Spider-Man is not a story about a teenager who gets beaten by a magical spider and then he fights crime. That's the plot of the story. But what the story is about is like teenage angst and teenage fantasies and being excluded and being a nerd and maybe being bullied and standing up to bullies and I don't know, crime in New York City, being an outsider, stuff like that. That's what the story is about. And if read or watch Spider-Man just as if it's only about the teenager who got beaten by a magical spider and now he fights crime, you're just focusing on a surface level, plot, just the plot, and you miss a whole layer where the juice of the story is. And I think that you can do the same thing if you look at the Bible. If you just don't focus on the plot as if that's the point of the story to tell you how this actual person went from here to there, but just like, what is the story telling me? What is the world that it is presenting? And then if you don't, come at it with preconceptions or, rigidity, I think it becomes interesting. It becomes interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's that truism that, writers write what they know. So it sounds like
Mhm,
you're
mhm.
trying to figure out what it is that the writers of the biblical stories knew about the world around them, about themselves. They have a voice of their own that they are, presenting. And I think also one thing that's left out of all of this is they didn't, I would imagine, expect that thousands of years later people would be reading
Wow.
what they wrote. So
No,
I always
it's very
think that
important.
it's yeah, it's very important to look at what they were trying to convey in their own time as opposed to the layers that history and reception have put upon their stories. Because, like you
Exactly.
said, we might focus on the icons or the iconography or the sort of symbolism that we've inherited that may not even be indigenous to the story, instead of looking at
Right.
what the story was trying to say in its time and place.
Right. I'm trying to not work against the story, but go with the story, wherever the story takes me. And just like as a writer, sorry, and just like as a writer, it's just like instinctively, I think, okay, who is that person? I do that for every story that I read. And there is not an inherent difference between writing in 2024 and writing in 500 BCE. The basic writing process, mental process, spiritual process, however you want to call it, is the same. The person lives so much of himself and his world in the text, whether he knows it or not. And if you identify that in the story, I think eventually the proof is in the pudding. If the story pops when you just read it in a specific perspective, that's, for me, okay, that means that this is the correct perspective, because now everything pops. Whereas before, in a more traditional reading, maybe it's clunky, as you said, it contradicts itself, it's silly, it's absurd. But if you just change your perspective while not changing the text, suddenly something happens, sometimes or always.
Could you maybe demonstrate how you go about representing these biblical stories in a new way?
Yeah, so I thought to bring in two examples, one about writing and one about editing. So first about writing, and let's talk about the story of baby Moses. Okay, let me remind you the story of baby Moses. Again, the story is not about the plot. Okay, the plot is that there is an evil king. He wants to kill Hebrew babies. Yada, yada, yada. He ends up raising a Hebrew baby in his house, the same Hebrew baby that will basically overthrow him. So if you read it as if the writer was serious about writing, about documenting these events and the stories about the plot, we can see immediately that the story crumbles under its own weight from the get-go. It just like doesn't hold water from the beginning, because it starts with an evil king who really wants to kill Hebrew babies, and he's going to fail twice. Once he's going to get outsmarted by midwives, and once he's going to get outsmarted by a mother, her daughter, and her baby. So if we look at how the king goes about it, there's an evil king, he wants to kill Hebrew babies. Does he hire his soldiers? Does he hire his personal guard? Does he hire maybe people who really hate babies? I think it would be good if he would just like hire people who really hate babies, and they would have no problem throwing the babies into the Nile. And he should probably hire Egyptians who hate the Hebrews, right, to make it work. And also a lot of them, just to make sure that you can kill a lot of them. But what he actually does, he hires only 2 women, Hebrews, who are midwives. And they're kind of famous for loving babies and like making sure that babies are alive and well. And these are the 2 people that the king hires in order to kill Hebrew babies. The last people that you would hire to kill babies are Hebrew midwives. It's a comically bad plan that is bound to fail. It cannot succeed. It's absurd. So we can now fight against the story and try to maybe explain it. Okay, maybe he was thinking about this or about that, or maybe we can go with the story. Okay, what if this is a comically bad plan bound to fail? And what if this is how the story is written? As a comedic story, where the king is an evil king who plots evil plots that fail, like the Wile E. Coyote, okay? He wants to get the Beep Beep character to fall off the cliff, he's going to fall off the cliff. So if we adopt this perspective when we go over the story, then we see suddenly that it pops and it's funny all the way. So it starts with the king hiring the last 2 people to kill Hebrew babies. Of course, they don't do what they were told. They trick him. They give the lamest excuse. Oh, the Hebrew mothers, they gave birth just before we got there. Okay, so then throw him then. It's not just like there's only a window in time when you can kill the Hebrew babies. You can kill them when they're 5 minutes old or even, 3 days old. So not only did they trick the king and they're not punished, but they get rewarded for it. They become rich, they have houses. Then Moses' mother basically gives the baby to the evil king's daughter, through the river. She puts it stationary in a river, just where the daughter, the princess, comes. She gives the baby to the princess and then tricks her in order to give her back the baby with money also. So she's ahead now. Instead of just like being, just breastfeeding her baby, now she's breastfeeding her baby and getting paid for it, which I think is very, very funny to have a woman getting paid to breastfeed her own baby. And then, of course, it ends with Moses being that baby that the Pharaoh raises, which will overthrow him. So it's like, ha ha, you are bound to fail. You fail at each and every turn. Your plans are not good plans. And I think it's like also it's a story that has a perspective that regular people, we are, smart and wily, and the kings and the royalty, they're cruel and also they're stupid, and we can outsmart them. I think this is the perspective of the story.
Yeah, and actually drawing out the humor in the story connects it also to the Book of Esther. And
Mm.
Esther's different because we sort of have culturally inherited a reading of that story that is itself farcical with the Purim spiel and everything else. We're very comfortable reading that as satire with an important message, but we don't necessarily apply the same metrics or the same kind of perspective when we're looking at the book of Exodus. And now I'm thinking it's often said that Esther is maybe one of the archetypal beginnings of Jewish humor, as sort of a cultural phenomenon. Maybe we should be looking at Exodus. I think because of the Seder and everything else, we tend to take the Exodus a little too
Yes.
seriously, perhaps.
Right. And I think with like another clue that this is not a serious story is that this is never mentioned again. Nobody ever mentions again the dead babies. Moses doesn't even know he was raised by the Pharaoh. He's going to meet the Pharaoh several times. They don't know about it. So it's like completely separate, and it doesn't affect the events that come after it. Like the Hebrews, when they get out of Egypt, they're going to miss it. That can't be the case if Egypt is where they lost all their babies, right? So this is just like a separate story that was placed at the beginning of Exodus, and we are just like used to reading it seriously. So we just like don't see the humor. But you don't have to do anything to see the humor, except just have that perspective in your mind as you go over it, and then it just clicks. There's nothing off there, or that doesn't fit this absurdist, silly populist comedy where the strong people are evil and stupid. It's kind of fun to see strong evil people fail, I feel.
That's always a delight for sure. So you mentioned that you also apply this to editing, the editing of the text as well.
Right. Okay. So this is one of my favorite bits. Okay. So let's go a little bit further in the plot of Exodus. So Moses grows up, he goes to the desert, right? He meets God there on his mountain, and God tells him, go take the Hebrews out of Egypt. To do that, you have to go and speak to the Pharaoh. That's your mission. And Moses says, no, I don't want to, right? At first, he says, they're not going to believe me. Then he says, I have a speech impediment. My back hurts. I have previous engagements. I can't do it. He's very, very adamant about it several times that he doesn't want to do it. And God tries to convince him. And then God tells him, you know what? I actually knew ahead of time that you didn't want to do it. So your brother, Aharon, will come in. I'm going to send him to speak to the Pharaoh. Don't worry, right? And then it gets to the place where they are going to the Pharaoh. And I sent you this part yesterday. There are 6 verses detailing that part where there is some very, very suspicious editing going on, where Moses and Aaron are going together, are doing something together, but the verb is in singular. Then it goes to plural and singular again. And what it seems is that someone added someone there that was just one person saying, walking, doing, was just Moses doing this, and someone added Aaron, the priest, into it, because I guess that writer was a priest, wanted to, have Aaron in the room when Moses is being heroic and, telling the Pharaoh, let my people go. So that's something that I noticed that a year and a half ago, and then I learned that someone found it 100 years ago. But I got to an episode about Aharon dedicated here, and then I was just like thinking only about him as I walked through the story. And let's now do this again, or maybe you want me to give an example of this blatant editing, just so people can get a taste for it.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay, so I'll read it in English. In English in your Bible it's corrected, but like literally I'll translate the errors, grammatical errors as is. This is Exodus 4:26 and 27. Okay, it's something like, it is he, both Moses and Aaron, to whom Yahweh told to take the Israelites out of Egypt. Those two who spoke to the Pharaoh is Moses and Aaron. So at first there was just one person, Moses. They attached Aharon and then added, actually 2 people did that. So it's like very, very suspicious editing and blatant editing. And someone added Aaron there. Okay. So when I got to an episode that I was just focusing on Aaron, I was like, okay, let's go back to the beginning of the story and let's just have Aaron in mind. Okay. So God tells Moses, go and speak to the Pharaoh. And Moses says, no, I will not speak to the Pharaoh. And God says, of course, Aaron will speak to the Pharaoh. I'm going to send him. Then they go. There's some suspicious editing. And who ends up speaking to the Pharaoh and telling him, let my people go? It's Moses who speaks to the Pharaoh, right? But he was very, very clear about it, that he doesn't want to speak to the Pharaoh. And God said, you will not speak to the Pharaoh. I am going to send Aaron to speak to the Pharaoh. It's like a divine mission. Then somebody messed with the text. And at the end, the person who didn't want to speak to the Pharaoh speaks to him. And the person who was sent to speak to the Pharaoh suddenly is, whatever, an extra. So like, how would you explain that?
It's interesting because there's quite a bit of scholarship about the true relationship between Miriam, Aaron, and Moses as folkloric heroes who essentially began as separate story traditions and then were brought together as siblings by the editor in the Torah as well. So all of this that you're drawing to, I think one thought is that, on the one hand, the Bible itself is considered a masterpiece of editing. And yet, on the other hand, there are these kind of slip ups, intentional or otherwise, that kind of give you and other readers a clue as to something being a little bit off. So,
Something is amiss.
yeah, something is amiss. So it really is fascinating to look at those seams and those cracks to see where maybe the editor is sewing these different stories together and trying to, input different information, different characters into stories where maybe they didn't originally exist.
Exactly. So let's use our logic now. If the mission Aaron was given was to speak to the Pharaoh, and then someone added a person there that was not there originally, and then Aaron is not speaking to the Pharaoh, logic says that Moses was added to that part, and actually Aaron was the one who spoke to the Pharaoh and told the Pharaoh, let my people go so we can worship our God in the desert. He is a priest. So this is why he's also worried about worshiping. So if someone was added and it's not Aaron because he's supposed to be there, then that means that someone added Moses in the editing and that he wasn't there at first, and someone took away the credit of the priest by giving the credit to someone else, like marginalizing the priest, making him, instead of a hero, making him an extra. So to me, this is basically a lead. This is a lead. This is interesting. What I would do now is think about, is there a historical period where politicians made a concerted effort to marginalize priests, take away their power, maybe oppress them and persecute them, and instead promote their own stories above that of the priests? And this would, this is not some guy editing it in a basement, right? This is like a royal decree coming from above, and you would also have to have control of the temple. So it's like a very, very specific political situation. So is there a period where this happened in real history? The answer is yes. That's as far as I know, there's only one period in Hebrew history that fits exactly this profile, and that's the Maccabean revolt, and in 140 BCE when they establish the new independent Hebrew state and kick out the priests from the temple and diminish the power of the priests forever. And so that's like a good lead to go and check it to see, okay, maybe there's something here. Maybe the editing was done there in order to take the credit away from the priest and promote another guy who wasn't there in the first place, because he said, I don't want to speak to the Pharaoh. So this is like what I see here. And this is, again, a lead to go and investigate further to see, okay, if there was editing in that time, we should see it in archaeology also, in history. And in fact, archaeology shows that 140 BCE was a major monumental year where the very Hebrew worship changed from being centered in the temple to becoming populist, and people are worshiping in their houses, and suddenly people know about the stories of the Bible where they didn't know before. So this is basically the route that I would go in order to try and understand what seems like just an editing snafu. This is just like an entrance to go into, okay, how could that happen? And it leads to really fun places.
Yeah. Historians now are looking at that period as perhaps the beginning of what we would call Judaism, because of what
Exactly.
you're saying that Shabbat is being observed by people on the sort of popular level and so forth and so on. So, with your podcast, what are your goals? What do you hope that the audience takes away from these kinds of lessons?
First of all, I'm just very curious about it and about every news story to see what comes up, see where it takes me. And I love ancient history. I love stories. I'm interested in people. So people who are interested in all of these, I think, might find it interesting. And what I learned along the way is that there's also like an emotional, cultural benefit here, where you feel that you know better your heritage, your tradition, whatever it might be, and you feel more connected to it, like organically. It's a sort of like reclaiming, but without having to take it away from someone else and stating this is mine. It's just like, no, this is as if this is yours, has always been yours. This is just stories. We know stories. Stories are easy to understand and follow. You don't have to be an expert to understand a story. We tell each other stories every day, and we love stories, and we love a good story. So all of this is present in this. It's like, for me, like a time capsule from days gone by of some basic genetic material of our culture today. So it's also relevant to go to that period in time, because it's present everywhere we go.
I think there's also the added benefit of connecting it implicitly with mythologies of other cultures, which we tend to read less, devotionally, certainly.
Yeah.
And we kind of see the humor, we see the fun, the play element in those stories in a way that we tend to, because again of our cultural inheritance, we tend to kind of weed out and overlook when we're
Mhm.
viewing our own biblical texts. So that's a very important element of this as well, it seems.
Also, to this point, when we read Greek plays and Greek tragedies and comedies, researchers know that the story is not about the plot, right? It's not about the Trojan War, actually, right? Each generation is retelling that story, and it's about what's going on in their time. It's not about whether Achilles fought this way or that way. That's just the plot to convey what the story is actually about. And that story changes according to when it is written, and that should also be applied to the Bible, because people are people, even if they're Hebrew, and even if, as you said, a long time after the dead, suddenly their work becomes very, very important. It's not their fault. They were just people.
So what's the best way for our audience to keep up with what you're doing?
You can just go to any podcast app that you're using and go to Podcast of Biblical Proportions, and start at the beginning, because it's serial. Like every episode builds on the things in the previous episode, and basically we're discovering things together as we go along, and it's fun.
Well, thanks so much, Gil, for joining us.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. I had a great time.
And thanks to our audience for watching.
Thank you.